Hello, Miss Hicks' class. Everyone has finished the other book, so we're going to start the new one, The Tiger Rising. This is by the same author as Because of Winn-Dixie. Chapter 1. That morning, after he discovered the tiger, Rob went and stood under the Kentucky Star Motel sign and waited for the school bus, just like it was any other day. The Kentucky Star sign was composed of a yellow neon star that rose and fell over a piece of blue neon in the shape of the state of Kentucky. Bob liked the sign. He harbored a dim but abiding notion that it would bring him good luck. Finding the tiger had been luck. He knew that. He had been out in the woods behind the Kentucky Star Motel, way out in the woods, not really looking for anything, just wondering, hoping that maybe he could get lost or get eaten by a bear and not have to go to school ever again. That's when he saw the old View Camp gas station building, all boarded up and tumbling down. Next to it, there was a cage, and inside the cage, unbelievably, there was a tiger. A real-life, very large tiger, pacing back and forth. He was orange and gold and so bright it was like staring at the sun itself, angry and trapped in his cage. It was early morning and it looked like it might rain. It had been raining every day for almost 2 weeks. The sky was gray, the air was thick and still. The fog was hugging the ground. To Rob, it seemed as if the tiger was just magic tricks rising out of the mist. He was so astounded at his discovery, so amazed, that he stood and stared, but only for a minute. He was afraid to look at the tiger for too long, afraid that the tiger would disappear. He started, and then he turned and ran back into the woods towards the Kentucky Star. And the whole way home, while his brain doubted what he had seen, his heart beat out the truth to him. Tiger, tiger, tiger. That was what Rob thought about as he stood beneath the Kentucky Star sign and waited for the bus. The tiger. He didn't think about the rash on his legs, the itchy red blisters that snaked all the way into his shoes. His father said it would be less likely to itch if he didn't think about it. And he didn't think about his mother. He hadn't thought about her since the morning of the funeral, the morning he couldn't stop crying great heaving sobs that made his chest and stomach hurt. His father watched him, standing beside him, and had started to cry too. They were both dressed up in suits that day. His father's suit was too small. And then he slapped Rob to make him stop crying. He ripped a hole underneath the arm of his jacket. "There ain't no point in crying," his father had said afterwards. "Crying ain't gonna bring her back." It had been 6 months since that day. 6 months since he and his father had moved from Jacksonville to Lister, and Rob had not cried since, not once. The final thing he didn't think about that morning was getting onto the school bus. He specifically did not think about Norton and Billy Threemonger waiting for him like chained and starved guard dogs, eager to attack. Rob had a way of not thinking about things. He imagined himself as a suitcase that was too full, like the one that he had packed when he left Jacksonville for the funeral. He made all his feelings go inside the suitcase. He stuffed them in tight, and then sat on the suitcase and locked it shut. That was the way he not thought about things. Sometimes it's hard to keep the suitcase shut. But now he had something to put on top of it, the tiger. So as he waited for the bus under the Kentucky Star sign, and as the first drops of rain fell from the sullen sky, Rob imagined the tiger on top of his suitcase, blinking his gold eyes, sitting proud and strong, unaffected by all the not thoughts inside, straining to come out. Chapter 2. "Looky here," said Norton Threemonger, as soon as Rob stepped onto the school bus. "It's the Kentucky Star. How does it feel to be a star?" Norton stood in the center of the aisle, blocking Rob's path. Rob shrugged. "Oh, he don't know," Norton called to his brother. "Hey, Billy, he don't know what it's like to be a star." Rob slipped past Norton. He walked all the way to the back of the bus and sat in the last seat. "Hey," said Billy Threemonger, "you know what? This ain't Kentucky. This is Florida." He followed Rob and sat down right next to him. He pushed his face so close that Rob could smell his breath. It was bad breath. It smelled metallic and rotten. "You ain't a Kentucky Star," Billy said, his eyes glowing under the brim of his John Deere cap. "And you sure ain't a star here in Florida. You ain't a star nowhere." "Okay," said Rob. Billy shoved him hard, and then Norton came swaggering back and leaned over Billy, grabbed hold of Rob's hair with one hand, and with the other hand ground his knuckles into Rob's scalp. He sat there and took it. If he fought back, it would last longer. If he didn't fight back, sometimes they got bored and left him alone. They were the only 3 kids on the bus until it got into town. And Mr. Nelson, the driver, pretended like he didn't know what was going on. He drove staring straight ahead, whistling songs that didn't have any melody. Rob was on his own, and he knew it. "He's got the creeping crud all over him," said Billy. He pointed to Rob's legs. "Look," he said to Norton. "Isn't it gross?" "Uh-huh," said Norton. He was concentrating on grinding his knuckles into Rob's head. It hurt, but Rob didn't cry. He never cried. He was a pro at not crying. He was the best not crier in the world. It drove Norton and Billy Threemonger wild. And today, Rob had the extra power of the tiger. All he had to do was think about it, and he knew there was no way he would cry. Not ever. They were still out in the country, only halfway into town, when the bus lurched to a stop. This was a surprising development, to have the bus stop halfway through its route. That Norton stopped grinding his knuckles in Rob's scalp, and Billy stopped punching Rob in the arm. "Hey, Mr. Nelson," Norton shouted. "What you doing?" "This ain't a stop, Mr. Nelson," Billy called out helpfully. But Mr. Nelson ignored him. He kept whistling his non-song as he swung open the door, and while Billy, Norton, and Rob watched, open-mouthed and silent, a girl with yellow hair and a pink lacy dress walked up the steps and onto the bus. Nobody wore pink lacy dresses to school. Nobody. Even Rob knew that. He held his breath as he watched the girl walk down the aisle of the bus. There was somebody even stranger than he was sure. "Hey," Norton called. "This is a school bus." "I know it," said the girl. Her voice was gravelly and deep, and the words sounded clipped and strange, like she was stamping each one of them out with a cookie cutter. "You're all dressed up to go to a party," Billy said. "This ain't the party bus." He elbowed Rob in the ribs. "Nah," Norton laughed. He gave Rob a friendly thud on the head. The girl stood in the center of the aisle, swaying with the movement of the bus. She stared at them. "It's not my fault you don't have good clothes," she said finally, and she sat down. put her back to them. "Hey," said Norton, "we're sorry. We didn't mean nothing." "Hey," he said again, "what's your name?" The girl turned and looked at them. She had a sharp nose and a sharp chin and black eyes. "Sistine," she said. "Sistine," hooted Billy. "What kind of a stupid name is that?" "Like the chapel," she said slowly, making each word clear and strong. Rob stared at her, amazed. "What are you looking at?" she said to him. Rob shook his head. "Yeah," said Norton. He cuffed Rob on the ear. "What are you staring at, disease boy? Come on," he said to Billy. And together they swaggered up the aisle of the bus and sat in the seat behind the new girl. They whispered things to her, but Rob couldn't hear what they were saying. He thought about the Sistine Chapel. He had seen a picture of it in a big art book that Miss Dupree kept on a small shelf behind her desk in the library. The pages of the book were slick and shiny, and each picture made Rob feel cool and sweet inside, like a drink of water on a hot day. Miss Dupree let Rob look at the book because he was quiet and good in the library. It was her reward to him. In the book, the picture from the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel showed God reaching out and touching Adam. It was like they were playing a game of tag, like God was making Adam it. It was a beautiful picture. Rob looked out the window at the gray rain and the gray sky and the gray highway. He thought about the tiger. He thought about God and Adam. He thought about Sistine. He did not think about the rash. He did not think about his mother. He did not think about Norton and Billy Threemonger. He kept the suitcase closed. Chapter 4. Sistine was in Rob's 6th grade homeroom class. Miss Simone made her stand up and introduce herself. "My name," she said in her gravelly voice, "is Sistine Bailey." She stood at the front of the room in her pink dress. All the girls stared at her with open mouths, as if she'd just stepped off a spaceship from another planet. Rob looked down at his desk. He knew not to stare at her. He started working on a drawing of a tiger. "What a lovely name," said the teacher. "Thank you," said Sistine. Patrice Wilkins, who sat in front of Rob, snorted and then giggled and then covered her mouth. "I'm from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania," Sistine said, "home of the Liberty Bell. And I hate the South because people in it are so ignorant. And I'm not staying here in Lister. My father is coming to get me next week." She looked around the room defiantly. "Well, thank you so very much for introducing yourself, Sistine Bailey. You may take your seat before you put your foot in your mouth any further." The whole class laughed at that. Rob looked up just as Sistine sat down. She glared at him. Then she stuck her tongue out at him. He shook his head and went back to his drawing. He sketched out the tiger, but what he wanted to do was whittle it in wood. His mother had shown him how to whittle, how to make a piece of wood and make it come alive. She taught him when she was sick. He sat on the edge of her bed and watched her tiny hands closely. "Don't jiggle the bed," said his father. "Your mama's in a lot of pain." "He ain't hurting me, Robert," his mother said. "Don't get all tired out with that wood," his father said. "It's all right. I'm just teaching Rob some things I know." But she said she didn't have to teach him much. His mother told him he already knew what to do. His hands knew. That's what she said. "Rob, I need you to go to the principal's office," the teacher said. Rob didn't hear her. He was working on a tiger, trying to remember the eyes. "Robert," she said. "Robert Horton." Rob looked up. Robert was his father's name. Robert was what his mother had called his father. "The principal wants to see you in his office. Do you understand?" "Yes, ma'am," said Rob. She got up, took his picture of the tiger, folded it up, and put it in his back pocket. On the way out of class, Jason Utmere tripped him and said, "See you later." And Sistine looked at him with her tiny black eyes. She shot him a look of pure hatred. Chapter 5. The principal's office was small and dark and smelled like pipe tobacco. The secretary looked up at Rob when he walked in. "Go right on back," she said, nodding her big blonde head of hair. "He's waiting for you." "Rob," said Mr. Filmer when Rob stepped into his office. "Yes, sir," said Rob. "Have a seat," he said, waving his hand to the orange plastic chair in front of his desk. Rob sat down. Mr. Filmer cleared his throat. He patted the piece of hair that was combed over his bald head. He cleared his throat again. "Rob, we're a bit worried," he finally said. Rob nodded. This was how Mr. Filmer began all of his talks with Rob. He was always worried. Worried that Rob did not interact with the other students. Worried that he did not communicate. Worried that he wasn't doing well in any way at school. "It's about your legs." "Yes, your legs. Have you been putting the medicine on them?" "Yes, sir," said Robert. He didn't look at Mr. Filmer. He stared instead at the paneled wall behind the principal's head. It was covered with an astonishing array of framed pieces of paper, certificates and diplomas and thank you letters. "May I, look?" asked Mr. Filmer. He got up from his chair and came halfway around the desk and stared at Robert's legs. "Yes, sir," he said after a minute. He went back behind his desk and sat down. He folded his hands together and cracked his knuckles. He cleared his throat. "Here's the situation, Rob. Some of the parents, I won't mention any names, are worried that what you got there might be contagious. Contagious means something that other students could possibly catch." Mr. Filmer cleared his throat. He stared at Rob. "Tell me the truth, son," he said. "Have you been using that medicine you told me about? The stuff the doctor in Jacksonville gave you? Have you been putting it on?" "Yes, sir," said Rob. "Well, let me tell you what I think. Let me be upfront and honest with you. I think it might be a good idea if we had you stay home for a few days. What we'll do is just give that old medicine more of a chance to kick in. Let it start working its magic on you, and then we'll have you come back to school when your legs have cleared up. What do you think about that?" Rob stared down at his legs. He felt the picture of the tiger burning in his pocket. He concentrated on keeping his heart from singing out loud with joy. "Yes, sir," he said slowly. "That would be all right." "That's right," said Mr. Filmer. "I thought you would think it was a good plan. I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll just write your parents, I mean your father, a note and tell him what's what. He can give me a call if he wants, and we can talk about it." "Yes, sir," said Rob again. He kept his head down. He was afraid to look up. Mr. Filmer cleared his throat and scratched his head and adjusted his piece of hair and then started to write. When he was done, he handed the note to Rob. Rob took it. When he was outside the principal's office, he folded the piece of paper up carefully and put it in his back pocket with the drawing of the tiger. Then he finally smiled. He smiled because he knew something Mr. Filmer didn't know. He knew that his legs would never clear up. He was free. Chapter 6. Rob floated through the rest of the morning. He went to math class and civics and science, his heart light, buoyed by the knowledge that he would never have to come back. At lunch, he sat out on the benches in the breezeway. He didn't go into the lunchroom. Norton and Billy Threemonger were there. and nothing had tasted good to him since his mother died, especially not the food at school. It was worse than the food his father tried to cook. He sat on the bench and unfolded his drawing of the tiger, and his fingers itched to start making it on wood. He was sitting like that, swinging his legs, studying the drawing, when he heard shouting and a high-pitched buzz of excitement, like crickets, that the kids made when something was going to happen. He stayed where he was. In a minute, the faded double doors of the lunchroom swung open, and Sistine Bailey came marching through them, her head held high. Behind her was a whole group of kids, and just when Sistine noticed Rob sitting there on the bench, one of the kids threw something at her. He couldn't tell what, but it hit her, whatever it was. Run, he wanted to yell at her. Hurry up and run. But he didn't say anything. He knew better than to say anything. He just sat and stared at Sistine with his mouth open, and she stared back at him. Then she turned and walked back into the group of kids, like somebody walking into deep water. And suddenly, she began to swing her fists. She was kicking, she was twirling. Then the group of kids closed in around her, and she seemed to disappear. Rob stood up so that he could see her better. He caught sight of her pink dress. It looked all crumpled, like a wadded-up tissue. He saw her arms still going like mad. "Hey!" he shouted, not meaning to. "Hey!" he shouted louder. He moved closer, the drawing of the tiger still in his hand. "Leave her alone!" he shouted, not believing the words were coming from him. They heard him then and turned around. It was quiet for a minute. "Who you talking to?" a big girl with black hair asked. "Yeah," said another girl. "Who do you think you're talking to?" "Go away," Sistine muttered in her gravelly voice, but she didn't look at him. Her yellow hair was stuck to her forehead with sweat. The girl with the black hair pushed up close to him and shoved him. "Leave her alone," Rob said again. "You gonna make me?" the black-haired girl asked. They were all looking at him, waiting. Sistine was waiting too, waiting for him to do something. He looked down at the ground and saw what they had thrown at her. It was an apple. He stared at it for what seemed like a long time. Then he looked back up, but they were still waiting to see what he was going to do. So he ran, and after a minute he could tell that they were running after him. He didn't need to look back to see if they were there. He knew it. He knew the feeling of being chased. He dropped the picture of the tiger and ran full out, pumping his legs and arms. They were still behind him. A sudden thrill went through him when he realized that what he was doing was saving Sistine Bailey. Why he would try to save Sistine Bailey, why he would want to save anybody who hated him, he couldn't say. He just ran. The bell rang before they caught him. He was late for English class because he had to walk from the gym all the way to the front of the school. And he didn't know where his drawing of the tiger was, but he still had Mr. Filmer's note in his back pocket. That was all that truly mattered to him. The note that proved he would not have to come back here. Chapter 7. It turned out to be an extraordinary day in almost every possible way. It started with finding the tiger, and it ended with Sistine Bailey sitting down next to him on the school bus on the way home. Her dress was torn and muddied. There was a scrape down one arm, and her hair stuck out in 100 different directions. She sat down in the empty seat beside him and stared at him with her black eyes. "There isn't any place else to sit," she told him. "This is the last empty seat." Rob shrugged. "It's not like I want to sit here," she said. "Okay," said Rob. He shrugged his shoulders again. He hoped she wasn't going to thank him for saving her. "What's your name?" she demanded. "Rob Horton," he told her. "Well, let me tell you something, Rob Horton. You shouldn't run. That's what they want you to do. Run." He stared at her with his mouth open. She stared back. "I hate it here," she said, looking away from him, her voice even deeper than before. "This is a stupid hick town with stupid hick teachers. Nobody in the whole school even knows what the Sistine Chapel is." "I know," said Rob. "I know what the Sistine Chapel is." Immediately he regretted saying it. It was his policy not to say things. But it was a policy he was having a hard time maintaining around Sistine. "I bet," Sistine sneered at him. "I bet you know." "It's a picture of God making the world," he said. She stared at him hard. She narrowed her small eyes until they almost disappeared. "It's in Italy," said Rob. "The pictures are painted on the ceiling. They're frescoes." It was as if a magician had cast a spell over him. He opened his mouth, and the words fell out, one on top of the other, like gold coins. He couldn't stop talking. "I don't got to go to school tomorrow on account of my legs. I got a note that says so from Mr. Filmer, the principal. He says the parents are worried that what I got is contagious, and that means the other kids could catch it." "I know what contagious means," Sistine said. She looked at his legs, and then she did something truly astonishing. She closed her eyes, reached out her hand, and placed it on top of Rob's leg. "Please, let me catch it," she whispered. "You won't," said Rob, surprised at her hand, how small it was and how warm. It made him think for a minute of his mother's hand, tiny and soft. He stopped that thought. "It ain't contagious," he told her. "Please let me catch it." Sistine whispered again, ignoring him, keeping her hand on his leg. "Please let me catch it, so I won't have to go to school." "It ain't a disease," said Rob. "It's just me." "Shut up," Sistine said. She sat up very straight. Her lips moved. The other kids shouted and laughed and screamed and called to each other, but the two of them sat far apart, as if their seat was an island in the sea of sweat and exhaust. Sistine opened her eyes. She took her hand away and rubbed it up and down both of her own legs. "You're crazy," Rob told her. "Where do you live?" Sistine asked, still rubbing her hands over her legs. "In the motel in the Kentucky Star." "You live in a motel?" she said, looking him up. "Not permanent. It's just till we get back on our feet." Sistine stared at him. "I'll bring you your homework. I'll bring it to you at the hotel." "I don't want my homework," he told her. "So?" By then, Norton and Billy Threemonger had spotted them sitting together, and they were moving in. Rob was relieved when the first thump came on the back of his head, because it meant he wouldn't have to talk to Sistine anymore. It meant he would end up not saying too much, telling her about important things, like his mother or the tiger. He was glad, almost, that Norton and Billy were there to beat him into silence. Hey, we will continue this book tomorrow.